Continuing with this effort to uncover the unorthodox teachings, the dangerous ideas in the beginning of wisdom, the series of Torah Club materials published in 2022 by the First Fruits of Zion. We are now up to number 22/23. I don't know why sometimes they make it 2 instead of 1. That's their business, but this is 22/23. And what we have today is a really straightforward thing. We have a gross mistranslation and a horrific, out of context misquoting of an early church document. And it is stunning how badly this was done. I was an English teacher for a decade, and this is the kind of thing that in any advanced class, right, you would expect this from a high school freshman. And you would still dock their grade for it, but you would expect this kind of sloppiness. If this was advanced English, if this was college English, and you turned, or a journalism class, or philosophy class, or religion class, and you turned in a paper with a quote like this, and your professor was curious enough and looked it up and saw what you'd done, you'd probably flunk. I would flunk the kid for it on that paper because this is so blatant. So let's take a look. That was a lot of buildup. Let's take a look. Here is the quote. For the Sabbath is a rest from creation, malakah, a remembrance of the completion of the world, a day for seeking of words of Torah, and for an expression of praise to God, to thank him for what he has given to mankind. Apostolic Constitutions, chapter 7, or book 7, chapter 36. You're looking at that and you're saying, wait a minute, we've got stuff in parentheses, we've got stuff in brackets. What is this? Now, obviously, that's not the original text. It wasn't written that way. It wasn't written in English. Obviously, it was probably in Greek. But you're saying, this looks funky, right? And the group discussion question at the bottom of the page is, discuss each of the 4 things the early followers of Yeshua said describing the Sabbath. So what you're trying to establish here, Daniel Lancaster is trying to establish what they thought of the Sabbath. All right, that's a great question. What did the early church think about the Sabbath? This would be a good example of it. Let's look. So here's the thing. Everybody makes mistakes, right? Myself included. But when you publish a book or materials like this, a study guide, shouldn't there be an editor who asks if the quote you're using means what you think it means? And yes, anytime I have that phrase, I can't help but hear Princess Bride playing it in my head. Inconceivable. Because this quote doesn't mean what he thinks it means, or at least what he's using it to mean. So in lesson 22 to 23 of the beginning of wisdom, Daniel Lancaster is quoting an anonymous work of the early church. It's probably from the 4th century. It's anonymous, so we're not sure. Known as the Apostolic Constitutions. Now, the quote is used by Lancaster to illustrate the supposed high view of the early disciples of Jesus for the Sabbath. That would be an interesting thesis, right? The early church had a high view of the Sabbath. What is the evidence? What can you show? An anonymous text is not the greatest thing because we don't know who it represents or what use it was put to necessarily, but it would be something. There's just one problem. While the author or authors of this material did indeed respect the Sabbath, and we're going to look at the whole quote, and you'll see they respected the Sabbath as something that had been important to God's work with Israel, the actual context of the quote is an entire extended paragraph about the superiority of the new covenant in Christ, including very specifically that of the Lord's Day as Resurrection Day, Sunday, over the Old Covenant and the Sabbath. So how can this quote be used for this purpose to which the Torah Club material is putting it? That's the opposite of how they're using it. And again, we'll look at the entire quote. We'll see what the author is actually trying to say. So how are we using it for that opposite purpose in Torah Club material? Well, easy enough. There's some mistranslation happening in here. Something First Fruits of Zion does all the time in their printed materials with quote-unquote my translation that you see over and over again. Every time you see my translation, I look up the original and see what did they change, why did they change it, and of course these explanatory brackets inserted into the text, and of course in this case word substitution, which is part of that blatant mistranslation. And so yeah, that's what they do. How could they use this quote like this? They do it all the time. They do it with scripture, which is of course a far greater error. So the original Greek word in this text that we're going to look at for law is namas. Now, that's presumably, that would be the normal Greek word for law, because any ancient editions have been lost. We don't have an original Greek. The oldest surviving manuscript of the Apostolic Constitutions we have is from the 12th century, and there's a very complex history of the text. I looked into it, and there's no way to simplify it enough to explain it here. Now, namas means law. In a lot of different contexts, it's used in many different ways. It's casually replaced by Lancaster with Torah in the quote used in the text here. Now I've pointed out this liberty taken with the New Testament text, which is a much more serious charge, over and over again in First Fruits of Zion publications. So whenever it's advantageous to their argument, Torah is inserted into a New Testament quote. Often when the author's context makes it clear that it's not specifically the law of Moses that he's writing about, it might be the broader concept of the law of God, the broader concept of right and wrong and divinely sanctioned ideas of that nature. It's not specifically Sabbath keeping and kosher and the festivals and all of that kind of thing. That's not what the author's thinking about, not what the context is talking about. But First Fruits of Zion says, oh, you know what? It makes our case if we put Torah in here. They do it all the time. They do it here. The second way in which this quote is abused, and this is the far more egregious abuse in this case, is by leaving out the context. Including the very next sentence, which dramatically undermines what Lancaster is trying to say. And so we're going to take a look at this. What it reminds me of, frighteningly and sadly, are the political commercials that we're seeing 24/7 in America here leading up to November, where quotes, where people are cut off in mid-sentence, where quotes are put together, where AI is being used. I mean, there's all sorts of lying happening in every direction at this point, and that's what this looks like. But this is supposed to be an organization that respects Jesus Christ and the truth and the gospel and honor, integrity, and all of those qualities that a disciple of Jesus should have. So how can you do this? Troubling. Let's look at an English translation, and it's an old-timey translation. It was the best one I could find in English. It reads like the King James, of the entire 36th chapter of Book 7. All the emphasis below is mine. That's what I've done, is emphasize, but it's the original author's words, of course, from that 12th century document translated into English. Let's take a look. Chapter 36, the good old Roman numerals. O Lord Almighty, thou hast created the world by Christ, and hast appointed the Sabbath in memory thereof, because that on that day thou hast made us rest from our works for the meditation upon thy laws. Thou hast also appointed festivals for the rejoicing of our souls, that we might come into the remembrance of that wisdom which was created by thee. How he submitted to be made of a woman on our account. He appeared in life and demonstrated himself in his baptism, how he that appeared is both God and man. He suffered for us by thy permission and died and rose again by thy power. Now, we're coming to that was a fairly positive understanding of the Sabbath and its role in God's creation. They revered that it reflects the creation account of Genesis 1. If that's all that Lancaster had said, I would say absolutely. That's how they felt about it. Look at the next slide. On which account we solemnly assemble to celebrate the feast of the resurrection on the Lord's Day. So the paragraph is about respecting about the respect they have for the Sabbath, but then it turns to the conversation about the incarnation in Christ and ends with a solemn celebration of the resurrection on the Lord's Day. Not on the Sabbath, according to the law of Moses, on the Lord's Day in memory of the resurrection. Let's keep going because we're getting to the heart of this. And this is the larger context. The quote is, of course, at the end. And rejoice on account of him who has conquered death and has brought life and immortality to life. For by him thou hast brought home the Gentiles to thyself for a peculiar people, the true Israel, beloved of God and seeing God. For thou, O Lord, broughtest our fathers out of the land of Egypt, and didst deliver them out of the iron furnace from clay and brickmaking, and didst redeem them out of the hands of Pharaoh and of those under him, and didst lead them through the sea as through dry land, and didst bear their manners in the wilderness, and bestow on them all sorts of good things. Thou didst give them the law, or Decalogue, which was pronounced by thy voice and written with thy hand. Thou didst enjoin the observation of the Sabbath, not affording them an occasion of idleness, but an opportunity of piety, for their knowledge of thy power and the prohibition of evils, having limited them as within a holy circuit for the sake of doctrine, for the rejoicing upon the seventh period. Aside from the fact that the word didst is in there a whole bunch, and that's annoying, you've got, again, more respect for an understanding of God's purpose with the Sabbath. Now, there was a phrase earlier, the true Israel, beloved of God, talking about the new covenant and those called by the gospel. I'm hoping, since I don't know this author, he's anonymous, that he's using that phrase in the way that Paul uses it in Romans, that not all descended from Israel are Israel kind of thing, that those who believe in the Messiah are the true heirs of Abraham in the spiritual sense. I hope he's not using it in that the church has replaced Israel and taken over their promises kind of thing. That's the replacement theology that I have always been against, and First Fruits of Zion, of course, says all of their critics are replacement theologians, which is laughable. So I don't know the author, because we anonymous, and that one particular phrase, because that's not the point of this paragraph. But again, respect, appreciation, but not what First Fruits of Zion is saying, that they are revering the Sabbath as a sacred day for them. And here's the quote, and here's the kicker. On this account, still talking about the past and the law of Moses, was there appointed 1 week and 7 weeks in the 7th month, and the 7th year in the revolution of these the Jubilee, which is the 50th year for remission, that men might have no occasion to pretend ignorance. On this account, he permitted men every Sabbath to rest, that so no one might be willing to send one word out of his mouth in anger on the day of the Sabbath. For the Sabbath is the ceasing of the creation, the completion of the world, the inquiry after laws, and the grateful praise to God for the blessings he's bestowed upon men. Up until this point, it's been a very positive statement. Again, respect, not disrespect. They appreciated the author and his community, what God had done through Israel with the Sabbath. And that is where the quote, the slightly changed, right? Torah thrown in there, inquiry after Torah. It says in the first fruits of Zion material, not inquiry after laws, because again, it doesn't seem that the author is speaking only about the law of Moses here. He's talking about the things of God and the will of God. Could be also talking about the prophets, could be talking about any other context there. It's not that specific, so it's not very helpful to insert Torah there. But what really puts this over the top and makes this egregious is this next sentence. And this is omitted. All which the Lord's day excels. So all of that appreciation for what God had done with the Sabbath, for what he had set up with the years of Jubilee in the law of Moses. There's a definite understanding of that, of the role that it played, of the purpose that it had for Israel. And then the author says, all which the Lord's day excels. And that was cut off in the quote. And here he continues and shows the mediator himself, the provider, the lawgiver, the cause of the resurrection, the firstborn of the whole creation, God, the Word and man, who was born of Mary alone without a man, who lived holily, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate and died and rose again from the dead, so that the Lord's day commands us to offer unto thee, O Lord, thanksgiving for all. For this is the grace afforded by thee, which on account of its greatness has obscured all other blessings. Again, another reference to the Lord's Day, and that being their day of worship, and how God's work through Christ obscures all other blessings. Let's talk about this then. So the compiler of the Apostolic Constitutions is writing about, or quoting someone else who had previously written about, the respect that the early church felt for the Sabbath because of the connection to creation and the Exodus. But at the same time, he emphasized that the Lord's Day, that is Resurrection Day, Sunday, had become, for their community of those who followed Jesus Christ, the day on which Jesus' followers gathered to worship, because what Jesus had accomplished in the Incarnation, the cross, and the empty tomb was so great that it excels what had been done before and obscured all previous blessings of God. Why then do Christians worship on Sunday? Is it because we hate the Sabbath and all things Jewish? Nonsense. That's a ridiculous straw man. That's not it at all. Why do we do that? Why do we worship on Sunday? We do so because even though God's work through Israel before Jesus was awe-inspiring and worthy of praise. I mean, amazing stuff that God did for the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, down through the centuries, through Moses and the prophets, and amazing stuff. Even though that's awe-inspiring and worthy of praise, read the Psalms, there's some amazing praise there. His work through Jesus and in Jesus puts all of it in the shade. There is nothing that God did before the Incarnation that can compare to what God did in the Incarnation. In terms of his grace, in terms of his love, in terms of his mercy, in terms of his commitment to humanity. The Incarnation is a greater visitation of God than Mount Sinai. Jesus Christ in the flesh, walking among men, reaching out and touching the lepers, right? Putting his hands on those who needed healing, hugging and letting the children come to him. It is a greater visitation than Mount Sinai, when the people weren't allowed to touch the mountain or they would surely die, when they were terrified of God. This is a greater visitation. Jesus Christ in the flesh. And the new covenant, which is open to all peoples, is a greater outpouring of God's grace than the law of Moses. Again, the law of Moses was an outpouring of God's grace. It was a way in which God could dwell among his people as a holy and righteous God and declare them to be holy and say, now you may approach me, you need to do X, Y, and Z, right, lest you die, to approach me. But again, there were layers keeping them away. They could not approach God as Abba. They could not boldly go to the throne of grace as we can, because the curtain is torn and Jesus Christ is victorious over sin and death. So yeah, the author of the Apostolic Constitutions revered the Sabbath and appreciated it and understood what God had done through Israel. But in this quote, he is declaring what Jesus Christ has done here among men is so much greater. It is so much more worthy of our worship and our praise and our honor of God. That's not what the quote is saying when First Fruits of Zion plucks it out of its context, puts the word Torah in there, and repurposes it. And if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to blatantly lie to people like that in your publications, that's a dangerous sign. That's just something I want people to be aware of. I use long quotes from First Fruits of Zion. I look at the context of every quote that I use to try to make sure that I'm not missing something, that I'm getting the flow of thought, that I'm understanding what they're saying. And so this is serious business, this misquoting. And so there you have it. Thank you.